author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It seems that the Democratic Party leadership is crumbling. Joe Biden goes from embarrassment to embarrassment. It's become almost an expectation. But what of the other power players? What of Kamala Harris, the heir apparent? What of Nancy Pelosi, once a formidable force, now almost certain to be on her way out the door? William Butler Yeats wrote, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." Has a party in disarray unleashed anarchy as it desperately tries to remain relevant and cling to power? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Coming up on today's show, Kamala and Hillary get together to try to save the failing vice president. Nancy Pelosi, alone and friendless as the Capitol seeks to move on from her years at the helm. We'll also be examining the Ukraine situation and why New York considers racism a public health emergency. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hagerstown, Maryland on WARK 1490 AM and 98.9 FM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. She's been at the forefront of the Democratic Party in California or in the nation's capital for more than 30 years. And for many, she is the face of the party, Nancy Pelosi. She talks tough, she tears up documents for photo ops, and many still consider her a powerhouse in Washington, D.C. But her days appear numbered. Joining us to figure out the machinations and power plays is longtime host of this here Liberty Nation radio show and senior political analyst for LibertyNation.com, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So tell me, is it a certainty, as many folks suggest, that this is Pelosi's last session as Speaker of the House, or does it all depend on the midterm results?
Well, she's almost certainly out as Speaker because the Republicans are almost certain to take control of the House this year. It's more a matter, I think, at this point, Mark, of how historic the GOP takeover will be. For example, in 2010, after Barack Obama's victory in 2008, in 2010, the GOP won 64 seats in the House, flipped 64 seats in the House. Democrats flipped over 40 in 2018 in Donald Trump's midterm. And Joe Biden is wildly unpopular on top of the historic trend of the out party winning an average of more than 20 seats in the first midterm of a new president. So there's almost no scenario, given their current very slim majority, that the Democrats really, that you could foresee the Democrats maintaining control. So then ask yourself, you've been Speaker of the House twice. You've now been denuded in a bitterly balkanized political climate. There's not much to stick around for, except to see the GOP reverse everything you've tried to do, and knowing that it won't go anywhere anyway because Biden will veto everything passed by the new GOP-led Congress. So there's not much for her to stick around for.
I mean, she will be 82 this year. I believe her birthday's in March. Happy birthday for March, Nancy. And it seems to me that if the folks in her own party and her friends in the fourth estate, they're hinting that she's too old for the role anyway. So why are they not publicly saying the same thing about President Joe Biden? Why does he get a pass?
Well, they can afford to say that about Pelosi. They can't about Biden. Because for Pelosi, it's a matter of any number of people who can come in right behind her. And there's not going to be a need for a Democratic speaker because they're not going to control the House. So it'll be a minority leader. And there's not much power in the minority in the House anymore, again, in such a balkanized environment. But they can say that about Pelosi because it's pretty much going to happen. It's obvious, but they can't afford to say it, Mark, about Joe Biden because he holds a singular office as opposed to being the leader of a large body like the House of Representatives. And if they started saying he was too old, which is something that everybody can see with their own eyes, then you start with stories like even the elite media is recognizing that Joe Biden is too old to be president, and they can't afford to do that because they're the ones that put him in office.
Yeah, I think part of that too is that the replacement, as you say, would be Kamala Harris, and she is just so unpopular. It's just incredibly surprising at how incapable and unpopular she seems to be, considering all of the hype that surrounded her appointment to the vice president office.
And now it's building on itself. For example, the pileup on the interstate near Washington, D.C., where hundreds of cars were stuck for more than a day. She made an unrelated comment about how America is moving again. And she got flamed on Twitter for saying America's moving again when people are stuck on an interstate. So she can't even win for losing. She's so unappealing and so unpopular. It's like she can't say anything.
I think there will still be a lot of people who support her, and that's more comes out of tribalism. And speaking of the I-95 issue with the snow blocking everybody, a good demonstration of tribalism is the amount of people on social media who took to their phones to blame Glenn Youngkin, saying, "Where is he? What's he doing?" That you chose wrong, Virginia, without realizing that Glenn Youngkin doesn't become governor until, I believe it's January 15th.
Even the conservative columnist, so-called conservative and yet never Trump, columnist Jonah Goldberg weighed in saying, well, Glenn Youngkin better take control of this if he doesn't want to get into trouble with the famously, unhappy voters of Virginia and D.C., et cetera. And then he, of course, had to reverse it because it was just a factual error. But on the other side, they're saying he's too busy. Glenn Youngkin's too busy trying to stop critical race theory when he can't even deal with stuck cars on an interstate. I mean, these people just make bigger fools of themselves each and every day, if that's even possible.
It really surprised me with Jonah Goldberg because as an author, not just as a columnist, he's very precise on his book about fascism. It was a fantastic read. It was very precise, and obviously coming from a slightly different political perspective.
Well, it shows you the problem with Twitter. You send something out without much thinking about it, and then you realize, oh, geez. And of course, he got flamed across the country. He just made a mistake, but that's the problem with Twitter. People tweet before they think.
And if the United States Postal Service worked well enough, we could start sending in letters. That would give us a chance to recall them before we hit the send button. Now, when others begin discussing your political demise, as they have done with Nancy Pelosi, when you yourself have made no mention of leaving, as has happened with both Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, what do you do? What does Pelosi try and do here? Does she spend her last few months legacy building? Or does she burn down the system that's casting her aside?
She's not really going to have the choice because it all really rests on what happens in the Senate and what happens most specifically with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, the degree to which they'll go along with anything that's sent up from the House that can be passed with 50 votes plus Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. But all the rest of it needs 60 votes because of that pesky filibuster, which Chuck Schumer is now making noises about trying to get rid of again, but it won't happen. But look, let me take you back to 2018, when the Democrats recaptured control of the House in the Trump midterm election. The only reason that Pelosi managed to become Speaker again was because she agreed that she would limit her tenure to 4 years. In other words, there was a movement then to say you're too old, you're part of the past, you're a great power broker and fundraiser, but your time has come and gone. And she said, okay. The compromise was she'd stay 4 more years. Those 4 years are up. So I think it's pretty easy for her to bail out and leave her legacy as a true, she was a powerhouse, as a deal maker, a power broker, a fundraiser, whipping her votes into shape very effectively over the years.
Time's up, Nancy Pelosi. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be looking at the New York governor's racism as a public health crisis debacle. But after this short break, American anxiety over the worsening Ukraine situation. What are the facts on the ground? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Russian troops continue to amass on the Ukrainian border, and yet Joe Biden assures us that a round of economic sanctions will save the day. China eats American lunch daily, mocks the United States, and is pushing Taiwan to the brink. But have no fear, President Biden, the supposed hero of Afghanistan, won't put up with any malarkey from the Middle Kingdom or Mother Russia. Are you comforted? Well, according to a recent polling, 54% of Americans are very concerned about such happenings, and more than 70% have been following the Ukraine story closely. One of the most reliable resources for giving us answers on these particular topics is retired Deputy Undersecretary for Defense Controller, J. David Patterson, who joins us today. Welcome back to the show, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be with you always. Happy New Year.
Oh, and Happy New Year to you. So tell me, Dave, are Americans right to be worried about the Ukraine situation?
Well, Mark, I think there's a case to be made that President Putin might invade perhaps the Donbass area of the eastern portion of the Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatists are already hold the area. But all of Ukraine, no, I don't see that happening.
Okay, and so what are the threats here? Are the sanctions that President Biden's talking about, are they if Putin moves into the Russian-held areas, or is it if he pushes beyond the Donetsk region?
Well, I think it's always important when discussing what Putin will or won't do to remember a speech that he gave in 2005 to his parliament, where he said the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century. I think he believes that. I think his actions and behavior testify to that belief, so that you always have to keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah, that was recently brought back to light in a documentary about Putin and Russia that I found very interesting. Apparently, he also used to work as a taxi driver, but I think everybody did back in those days if they had a car. So I guess it all comes down to whether, for American anxiety, whether something will happen or not. Now, do you see this with your experience in the realm? Do you see this just sort of fizzling out, or are there more moves to be played in this international chess game?
I think that when it comes to the Ukraine and what former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called New Europe, the U.S. is a major player, but it is not as major as NATO and particularly the European Union, and that's true for many reasons. The European Union primarily because of the economic dimension that it represents in Europe, and I think the United States does not need to play such a heavy hand in the situation to be effective.
With the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and with Europe being so reliant on the flow, you wrote in LibertyNation.com that Europe gets 43% of its energy from Russia. Now, add into this that Germany is closing half of its 6 nuclear power plants. And it seems to me that Europe and the EU itself, they're not really in a position to play hardball against Russia. And now, is that why America is having such an outsized role in this, at least publicly?
Well, I think the simple answer is that the United States is playing an outsized role, as you put it, because President Putin has elevated Biden into that role with phone calls and pushing for the NATO-EU-Russia negotiations, which start this Friday. And, Putin didn't call Luxembourg. But putting the United States in the middle, Putin is in a kind of a perverse way, it elevates his station and his message on the global stage. His message, of course, being that he is the victim.
Let's talk about messaging in particular, but more so the American messaging. Now, there have been a number of criticisms of this administration and the Defense Department in particular that say the goals of the department are not in line with what the American public think they should be. Now, of course, there's the more extreme examples, doing reports on what pronouns should be used in the military. But in terms of actual defense issues, it seems that the average guy and gal, they don't have the same motivations or wishes for what the Defense Department would do. Now, is that because they don't grasp the interconnected complexities, or is it because there is more of an ideology in the Defense Department and the government at large?
Well, I think in too many cases, the goals of the Department of Defense have indeed not lined up with what Americans outside the Beltway think they should be and what they believe. And I think that's basically because they understand that what they learned in 8th grade civics actually was important. The average U.S. citizen goes after, doesn't quite understand or see the value for the Department of Defense going after white supremacists and domestic terrorists within its ranks. And especially when the Department of Defense, can't find any of the former and can't define the latter. They see the disaster that the withdrawal from Afghanistan left America with. They see the ugly results of the lack of leadership that resulted in innocents being killed in a drone strike, and then no one held accountable. The average American is not confused with what they're seeing, and quite frankly, they don't see it as a complex situation. They see it as a very straightforward lack of leadership situation.
Well, let's talk about that leadership briefly. Obviously, there's, on one hand, there's Mother Russia, and on the other hand, there's China, the great red dragon. Now, do you think that China's watching what happens in Ukraine very, very closely? Because if I were Taiwan, I would be seeing a lot of parallels between where I live and what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and America's reaction to that.
Well, I think it's safe to say that China watches everything that the United States does. And, the Ukraine notwithstanding, they've come online saying that they support Biden or Putin in his challenge to the United States. But never be confused on this point. China is the most important threat that the United States has. And it's both military threat and an economic threat. And so we shouldn't be surprised when China does anything or comes out publicly in any way to challenge the United States, whether it's backing Putin in his victimhood, or whether it's or being very belligerent and bellicose in the South China Sea.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to be with you.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Later on in the show, we're talking Liberty with Scott Cosenza. What's the fallout from the Maxwell trial? But coming up next, we're chatting with Sarah Cowgill on When Kamala Met Hillary. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Vice President Kamala Harris is sinking faster than a stone. Her polling numbers are disastrous for someone who is touted as the very next president. Biden himself said he was merely a transition. So what's a girl to do other than to turn to the grand old dame of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton? What level of blindness must be necessary to treat as an oracle the one person who just can't fathom that she lost? Helping us out with this conundrum is national columnist and co-producer of the Conservative 5 TV show, Sarah Cowgill. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Now, give us the detail. What happened between Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton?
I have no idea what happened between them. I know that she has been asked to be, a new influx of positivity into the vice president's handling of immigration and some other issues. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Seeing as
she's
Donald
one
Trump
of the most
ran
hated
on,
women in the world.
yeah, Donald Trump ran on controlling immigration, and Hillary Clinton ran against that. And so the idea that Kamala Harris could pick up some useful vignettes or peaches or pearls of wisdom in how to deal with the U.S. border. I mean, perhaps if she were truly looking for solutions to the problem, she might to go to Trump Tower in New York City. But I don't think she's quite willing to do that. Now, are there any other notable figures that Harris could ask for advice? I mean, regardless of one's opinion of Nancy Pelosi, she's been the leader of her party in the House for a decade and in Congress for more than 30 years. Why wouldn't Harris reach out to Pelosi for help?
I don't think the Speaker of the House has any better reputation on handling issues or being popular. She's only popular within her own, microcosm on Capitol Hill. She's not the most popular woman out there either. And they, Hillary Clinton, the funny thing was, she may have run in 2016 with a more let them all in and let's hug it out kind of platform. But it wasn't much earlier than that she was voting unanimously on the Senate floor to, put in 700 miles of border barriers, fences, somewhat, some might call it a wall.
A wall by any
so
other name.
She flip-flopped when things were looking like the progressives were getting the most attention. That's when things started to change in the Democratic Party. But Hillary was never anti-border security. She was always more of a no, shut the door, until it wasn't popular to say shut the door.
I believe that's the same position held by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama until they got into office. So I think a lot of Vice President Harris's issues stem from the fact that she wants to be associated with the big topics of the day. But as several of her staff have noted, she refuses to do the hard work that's required to really understand the complexities of that.
I don't think she has the ability to do the hard work. It's like journalists. They can read the news. It doesn't make them an expert in, reading the news. Television journalists. If you're writing the news, you have to have some sort of ideas of what the issues are. But for the most part, you see that churned out constantly. So there's not a lot of expertise. Like when you go into the field of law, you can be a criminal defense attorney. You're focused on that specific genre, discipline. And she doesn't have that focus. Her focus in California was putting people in prison. That's all she did. She did it very well, if you ask the people of California. So I don't see that she has tapped anybody to help that out. She's going to have to do the work, like you said, the hard work. And I don't think she has the ability to think outside her own little box of a brain. I just don't think she has the capability.
I think part of the issue is that she's so determined to become the next president that she wants to create an aura around herself of being independent and capable. And that's not the job. Yes, the executive office is a lonely place to be, but you have a team of staff that you need. You have secretaries of state, secretaries of defense. You have all these people on which to call. And I think part of Harris's problem is that she's not willing to show that weakness, or as she perhaps perceives it, as a weakness of reaching out to other people. So, for example, as the new intake into the Biden administration, who's one of the more high-profile people? It's Mayor Pete. But there's quite clearly a bit of competition between the two because Mayor Pete thinks that he's in for a line at the top spot. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think he is in line for the top spot. I think this is a last-ditch effort by the vice president to try and salvage the horrible reputation that she has. She has a reputation for being mean and nasty and out of touch and unavailable. You can't do that and run for president. So, I don't see her doing much of that kind of paving the way for herself. I mean, that's where you build your bridges and you make friends with these people and you get their advice, you study their advice, you apply their advice, and then you have the ability to handle the media when they're asking you questions. You know how to answer. You don't just giggle and hope that somebody thinks your smile is pretty. She's just not doing it. It's like she's expecting which could be because she was put into office. She didn't run and win. She was placed into office. So maybe she just feels that she's entitled to just be placed into the next one and not have to do the work. It's all about being the first. And maybe that's her, Achilles heel.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of she was expecting to be the next president because that's what Joe Biden said. He said he was the transition candidate. I mean, he has referred to Kamala Harris as President Harris more times than probably Kamala Harris has herself in that mirror in her bedroom
Yeah,
wall.
he has a few mental problems, I think. That's just my opinion. But
So what can Harris do at this stage? I mean, we know that the congressional elections are coming up this year, and that really could shift the balance of power in D.C. In fact, it's likely to if we look at historical trends and precedents. So her position is going to be much more of one for overseas visits, things that Joe Biden can't drag himself away from Delaware from. How does she reposition herself to try and take back that impetus that she had when she was granted the vice presidency?
Mark, there are a lot of king and queen makers in the Beltway. Kiki McLean is one of those people. How do she salvaged Bill Clinton's cigar problem and Hillary Clinton's "I ain't some kind of stand by your man" problems, and boosted them to the national heights. Kiki McLean is a goddess when it comes to remaking, retooling, and polishing an image for the cameras. She's got that. She is the maven of making somebody a better person for the public. So, they had a luncheon, not too long ago, to try to retool that image with some of the, the biggest gals in the area in the Democratic Party. They are the one to go to. And nothing happened after that. I mean, she just kind of faded into the background. If Kiki McLean is involved, that could be why there's a Hillary Clinton being tapped into some, issues. Other than that, I don't know how Harris fixes her problems. She's got a lot of them. And it's not just that she bungled and said something funny. She's got a lot of them, and they keep building up. And if you make a laundry list out of them, it's going to be easy to, fire away at that laundry list if she's running for office.
Well, according to Joe Biden, of course, that won't be for at least another 7 years, will it? Sarah Cowgill, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. Race becomes a public health crisis in New York. Coming right up after this message. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation's special Talking Liberty, where we examine the hot cases and how they impact you and your constitutional republic. As ever, we're joined by legal analyst and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back, Scott.
Hi, Mark. Thank you.
So the first question I have to ask, Scott, is about New York Governor Kathy Hochul. She's declared that racism is a public health crisis. Now, what are the legal ramifications here, Scott? And is this as bizarre as it sounds?
Well, Mark, it's no mere executive level declaration. The state of New York has passed a law that says it's a crisis. So we're well beyond the simple, I declare this day, Apple Orchard Day, which I'm sure they have in New York, and I'm sure it's a fine day. But no, this is an actual state law that does it. It is, I think, a perfect encapsulation of the farce of the entire thing. If we just look at the law itself, which I have done, and for people taking notes at home, it's A05679 is the actual, that's the assembly bill that was passed into law. Now, Mark, the law establishes a commission basically to study and, things about race and receive data about race. It's hilarious because the appointments to the commission are the commissioner of health, their designee, and two appointees of theirs, or rather, and one appointee of theirs, and then two appointees of the governor, and then four from the legislature. But the funny thing is, the commissioner of health is appointed by the governor, and the governor gets to appoint, I think, one or two people directly. So almost all the appointments, at least 50%, if not,
I know
greater
what you're
than
going to say
50%
here.
are wholly
Democrats.
controlled by the governor. Okay, but it's designed to act like they're not. And if you know how government works, is the assistant to the governor, who's the person who says how it is, picks up the phone of the commissioner of health and says, "Here's who you're appointing to this commissioner." So that's just one thing. It's just a vehicle for Kathy Hochul to say whatever she wants. But it doesn't stop there. That's just the beginning. The best part is that the law was passed and signed into law on December 22nd, 2021. Well, the only thing that the law sort of requires work-wise is that this commission produce a report. The report is supposed to occur biannually, so every other year. And the first report was due December 31st, 2021. All right, so let's get our math straight. The bill's signed into law December 22nd. The report's due December 31st, but here's the catch, Mark. At the last line of the legislation says this act shall take effect on the 30th day after it shall have become law. So it cannot take effect, Mark. Now, I'm licensed to practice law and not math, but I do think that it seems clear that 30 days past December 22nd is after December 31st. So the law
let's just figure that out, Scott.
Cannot exist.
Wait, hang on. So you add that, you carry the one, you subdivide by that, and it's it's nonsense. Right, I've got you.
It's totally nonsense. There'll be a report required in 2 years. Now, these commissioners are not paid a salary, Mark, but they are entitled to reimbursement of expenses. So maybe they have to lease a car or an SUV to drive around the state and examine issues about race,
or a hotel room, or
perhaps
a fact
fly to
finding
Puerto Rico in the
Jamaica.
wintertime to listen to the stories of other marginalized communities. That's something I think we can expect to see a fair bit of if the past is our guide to the future in New York politics.
Okay, and I can't let you go without discussing the fallout from the Ghislaine Maxwell case. Now, a federal judge unsealed an agreement between Epstein and one of Epstein's accused, Virginia Guthrie, as soon as the verdict came down for Maxwell. Now, we have that agreement on our site, on the Liberty Nation website in full, but what's the short version?
Mark, I am fascinated by the claims that Virginia Roberts Giuffre, she used both last names, Virginia Roberts, sometimes Virginia Giuffre, and others. Because of the heinous nature of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes against these young women, some of the young women's claims that are seemingly false or altered or designed to punish have not been subject to kind of robust sort of fisking or examination or cross-examination, as the case may be. And that is what interests me, is the cross-examination. And by that I mean, I think that some of these Epstein claims were brought about as a way, it sort of dovetails into, and I got a little bit of a tinfoil hat on, half a hat maybe, which is that remember the full court press that went on against Donald Trump, whether or not there were, actual crimes to support it or not. And I think part of that zeal for Epstein was that Trump could be tied and linked to Epstein. And I just want to see where that goes. And Virginia Roberts, Virginia Giuffre is partly key to that because her allegations include politically motivated allegations, I believe. Her attorney was David Boyce, who's a Democrat operative lawyer type. And some of her claims have been openly sort of publicly refuted by Alan Dershowitz, who I regard very highly. And she has said that basically Epstein gave her to Dershowitz sexually. And that's been kind of, there are competing counterclaims of libel and slander from both of them to the other. And I think that for the first time in this coming trial or court cases that they have against each other, we're actually going to see in open court the evidence. And that's what this revelation of this settlement document provides, some sunshine and sunlight on the whole thing. The Ghislaine Maxwell trial was conducted basically almost entirely in secret. So we don't really understand what went on and why.
It's interesting that you mention Alan Dershowitz because the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, as soon as the Maxwell verdict dropped, had on as an impartial analyst Alan Dershowitz. which, seeing as he's been accused of being alongside Jeffrey Epstein in some cases, they realized the day after, apparently. So somebody's probably getting fired at the BBC, but to have him on as an analyst in a case
he's
in
not
which
just accused. That's one thing. Like guys like Les Wexner, some pretty powerful people, former Senator Bill Mitchell, I think, and there's quite a few who apparently that it seems apparent that Ms. Roberts just either basically made up out of whole cloth. That's what it seems like. But I'll be interested to see what plays out in court. But Dershowitz, I was just going to say, is not just an alleged perp. What he has engaged openly, he has challenged Virginia Roberts and called her a liar and said that not only is she a liar, like there's not a mistake. He said he's never even met her. It's not like he said, well, there was like a small massage that wasn't sexual. No. He says, I've never met this person, much less engaged in inappropriate activity with them. And he has receipts to prove it, literal receipts of like where she says they were in, New York and he was in LA with a hotel receipt and cell phones and whatever. So the evidence there seems very interesting. And it's one of the reasons why, for people paying attention to the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, Mark, one of the kind of things that was questioned by a lot of people is why wasn't so-and-so brought to trial to testify, because their testimony was even more heinous or revealed more bad conduct from Maxwell. And the reason why Alan Dershowitz speculates is because then they would have to undergo cross-examination against their character and previous false statements, which he says he's eager to do for Virginia Roberts. So and there's also, like, if you want to peel the onion layer, another layer, that lawyer that we talked about, David Boyce, he's been basically taken off the case and removed from her as being her lawyer so that he can testify, because Dershowitz wants to call him as a fact witness regarding her lies against him. So there's a lot there. I mean, it's one of these things where it will keep the real conspiracy theorists up for a generation to come, the kind of levels and layers that are involved in the case.
Well, we'll only be covering the real stuff on LibertyNation.com. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's it for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Dave Patterson, Sarah Cowgill, and the uncaped constitutional crusader, Scott DeCosenza Esquire, for joining us. And of course, thanks to you, the faithful listeners, for tuning in each week. I appreciate you all. My final thoughts for this week. In a time that saw the Democrats paint almost half the country as extremists and will brook no division on that particular issue, it's perhaps time to take advice from one a little wiser than they. Coming back to William Butler Yeats, he wrote, quote, "Out of the quarrel with others, we make rhetoric. Out of the quarrel with ourselves, we make poetry," end quote. We spend so much of our efforts and our hearts on making arguments to persuade others or to express our points, often in anger. Maybe we need to be more independent. We can't convince everyone. We just need to be the truest form of ourselves. Lead and persuade by example. Forget the petty word games. Ignore the provocations so clearly designed to undo us. And focus on being the best version of ourselves. Now that's a powerful thing. That's poetry by any other name. And that's a quarrel worth having. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.